Welcome to Tales Revisited. This is a place for quiet stories, for moments that once shaped worlds and still echo if you know how to listen. Some stories are loud, others are quiet, but just as powerful. This is a place for those quiet stories, for moments before the storm, and echoes that still shape the world. Welcome to Tales Revisited. In the quiet corners of Middle-earth, there are places the world seems to forget. Soft hills, gentle paths, and small round doors built into the earth. This is the Shire. A land untouched by war, untroubled by the weight of history, where the loudest sound is often the wind moving slowly through the grass. Here, time does not rush, it does not demand. And in a quiet hillside, beneath a round green door, lives a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins. Bilbo is not thinking of dragons, or distant mountains, or the long road beyond the Shire. Tonight, he is thinking of tea, of warm firelight, of the gentle comfort found in familiar things. The kettle hums softly, a sound so calm, it feels like breathing. Outside, the stars settle into place, one by one, as if even the sky knows it is time to rest. Bilbo leans back in his chair. The wood creaks in a way he knows well, a sound that means home. There are stories in this world, great ones, tales of fire, shadow, and courage. But tonight is not for those stories. Tonight belongs to the quiet moments in between. The moments where nothing is asked of you, where the world simply lets you be. And for now, that is more than enough. Long before the Shire had borders, before it had roads or names or maps, there were hobbits. Not the settled folk we know today, but wandering ones. Small figures moving quietly through the wild edges of the world, living between forests and rivers, keeping to themselves, and rarely noticed by the taller folk around them. They did not call themselves hobbits then. That name would come much later. In the oldest records, written in languages long forgotten, they were known simply as the Little People. They lived close to the earth. They understood the moods of the soil, the rhythm of the seasons, and the quiet wisdom of waiting. Long before kings rose and fell, before towers pierced the sky, before great wars reshaped the lands, the hobbits were already there, living unnoticed between the pages of history. Few now remember this, but the hobbits once lived far to the east, near the upper vales of the Anduin River. They shared that land with taller folk, ancient men, early dwarves, and shadows that moved beneath the trees. Life was not always peaceful. The world was changing. Dark things stirred in distant places, and the quiet valleys were no longer safe. So the hobbits did what they have always done best. they adapted. Some crossed the great river, seeking gentler hills and softer skies. Others lingered, cautious and patient, watching the world shift around them. Over time, 3 kindreds emerged. The Harfoots, smallest of the hobbits, nimble, brown-skinned, fond of hillsides and hidden paths. The Stores, broader and stronger, comfortable near water, with a fondness for boats and riverbanks. And the Fallowhides, taller, bolder, more curious than the rest, often wandering farther than they should. It was the Fallowhides who would one day shape much of Hobbit history. From them came the Took line. And from the Tooks, a certain curious hobbit named Bilbo. But long before Bilbo ever found a ring or heard the knock of a wizard at his door, the Shire itself had to be born. When the hobbits finally crossed westward, they found a land untouched by great powers. Rolling green hills, quiet streams, soil rich enough to cradle 1,000 gardens. They called it Susa at first, then Suzat, and eventually, simply, the Shire. It was granted to them not by conquest, but by permission. The kings of men, long since forgotten, allowed the hobbits to settle there under one simple rule. They were to keep the roads clear and remain peaceful folk. The hobbits agreed gladly. They had no desire for crowns or banners. They wanted gardens, meals, and quiet evenings. Over generations, the Shire became something rare in Middle-earth, a place where time slowed. While empires rose and fell elsewhere, the Shire endured. Its people measured history not in wars, but in harvests, birthdays, and well-told stories beside the fire. And yet, even in such peace, echoes of the wider world lingered. Old songs were sung whose meanings had faded. Stories told of dark forests beyond the borders, of tall figures that watched from the distance. Most hobbits laughed these tales away. After all, nothing ever happened in the Shire. But that belief was a fragile thing. For even in the quietest places, history has a way of knocking. And sometimes it knocks on a round green door. Long before Bilbo Baggins ever stepped beyond his round green door, before the Shire had even heard the word adventure, the ring already had a long and troubled history. It did not begin in the Shire. It did not begin with hobbits at all. Long ago, in the deep places of Middle-earth, when the world was still young and the shadows were learning how to stretch, a power was being forged in secret. In the fires of Mount Doom, the Dark Lord Sauron poured much of his own strength, will, and malice into a single ring. Not as a symbol, but as a vessel. A vessel meant to dominate the others, to bend minds, to bind wills. And for a time, it worked. Kings fell under its influence. War spread across the lands, and Middle-earth trembled beneath the weight of power it was never meant to hold. But the ring was not destroyed. It was cut from Sauron's hand by Isildur, heir of the kings of men. And in that moment, the fate of the world shifted. Isildur did not destroy the ring. He kept it. Not out of cruelty, not even greed at first, but because the ring was already whispering to him. It promised legacy. It promised preservation. It promised that his father's sacrifice would not be in vain. But the ring does not keep promises. On the Gladden fields, as Isildur tried to return home, orcs fell upon him. In desperation, he slipped the ring onto his finger and vanished from sight. Yet invisibility was not safety. An arrow found him in the dark waters, and as his life faded, the ring slipped from his hand and was lost. For centuries, it lay hidden beneath the riverbed, silent, waiting. Time passed. Kingdoms rose and fell. Songs were forgotten. Until one quiet day, a creature named Deagol found it by accident. Pulled from the riverbed like an unwanted secret. And standing beside him was Smeagol. The ring worked quickly. It showed Smeagol visions of power, of possession, of desire so sharp it hurt to breathe. And so, on his birthday, he murdered his own kin. That was the ring's first true victory. Smeagol fled beneath the mountains, driven by guilt and hunger, and a whisper he could never escape. The ring gave him long life, but twisted it into something hollow. His body bent, his mind fractured, his name faded. And in the dark, he became Gollum. For nearly 500 years, the ring fed on him. Not in grand acts of conquest, but in quiet corrosion. It stretched his life thin until it was little more than a whisper clinging to breath. Yet even in that darkness, the ring was waiting. Waiting for a moment, for a chance, for a hand that would carry it back into the world. And then one day, footsteps echoed in the tunnels. A small figure, lost and afraid, stumbled into Gollum's domain. A hobbit. Not a warrior, not a king, not even someone looking for adventure. Just Bilbo Baggins. Fate had finally turned its gaze toward the Shire. And everything was about to change. The ring did not move by chance. It never had. It waited. It listened. And when the moment was right, it acted. For centuries, it had fed on Gollum, not with kindness, but with dependency. The ring gave him life beyond its natural span, and in return, it hollowed him out. Yet even Gollum was never meant to be its final bearer. The ring was patient. It always was. It sensed the world changing. Sauron was stirring again. Power was rising in distant places. And the ring knew it needed to move. So it slipped. Not through force, not through struggle. Just a quiet moment by a dark pool of water. One careless movement, one small hand reaching down. And suddenly, the ring was free. When Bilbo found it, there was no thunder, no whisper of doom, no sense of destiny. Just a small, cold circle in the dark. That is how the ring works. It does not announce itself. It waits for curiosity, for kindness, for mercy. And Bilbo had all three. The ring did not choose him for strength. It chose him for gentleness, for patience, for the ability to feel pity even when afraid. When Bilbo faced Gollum in the dark, he could have killed him. The ring would have welcomed that choice. But Bilbo hesitated. He saw misery instead of a monster, loneliness instead of evil. In that moment, the ring faltered. It had never encountered mercy before. That single act, sparing Gollum's life, changed the fate of Middle-earth. Even Gandalf would later say that pity stayed Bilbo's hand, and that pity would rule the fate of many. The ring tried to bind itself to Bilbo after that, not with cruelty, but comfort. It made him feel safe, invisible, protected. It whispered that he deserved it. And for many years, it worked. Bilbo aged slowly, so slowly that others began to notice. But unlike Gollum, Bilbo did not wither. The ring could not fully consume him. Something in Bilbo resisted. Perhaps it was his love of simple things, food, stories, warm firelight. Perhaps it was the Shire itself, quietly anchoring him to something good. Or perhaps the ring had made a mistake. For the first time in its long existence, it had chosen someone who did not want power. And in doing so, it planted the seed of its own undoing. Far away, shadows stirred. The Dark Lord felt something stir in the world, a presence long thought lost. But the ring was no longer where he expected. It was not in the hands of kings, not worn by warriors, not wielded by tyrants. It was resting quietly in a small round hole beneath a hill. And that made all the difference. Because evil understands power, but it does not understand mercy. Mercy, quietly held, would one day undo it all. There are moments in the history of Middle-earth that feel like sunlight through leaves. Moments that ask nothing of you, except to slow down and breathe. One of those moments begins with the sound of footsteps on a quiet road. A tall figure leaning on a staff, a wide gray hat, a long beard catching the morning light. Gandalf had come to the Shire again. Not with urgency, not with warnings or prophecy, but with a smile and a pocket full of fireworks. The hobbits always knew when he arrived, not because he announced himself, but because laughter followed him wherever he went. Children ran through fields to greet him. Older folk smiled from doorways, pretending not to care while hoping he'd stay a little while longer. Gandalf loved the Shire for exactly this reason. It asked nothing of him. It expected no miracles. Here, he could simply be. He walked the winding road slowly, tapping his staff against stone, pausing to admire gardens that had no need of magic. Hobbits waved from their doors. Some offered ale, others offered gossip. Gandalf accepted both. He knew their names, their children's names, which pies were best, and which gardens hid the juiciest strawberries. When evening came, he would sit beneath the party tree and tell stories. Stories of distant mountains, of stars older than memory, of small acts of courage that changed the world. The hobbits listened wide-eyed, never suspecting that their quiet guest had walked through fire and shadow beyond imagining. To them, he was simply Gandalf, the friend who brought light into the dark. And on this visit, he had come to see Bilbo. Bag End was warm as ever, the kettle hummed, the table was laid. Bilbo greeted him with a familiar smile, though Gandalf noticed something had changed. Not in the house, not in the Shire, but in Bilbo himself. There was a lightness about him, and yet something held just beneath the surface. A hesitation, a pause between thoughts. Gandalf felt it immediately. The ring was here. But for now, he chose not to speak of it. Instead, he laughed, he ate, he listened. Because moments like this were rare, and once gone, never returned. Outside, the Shire drifted into evening. Lanterns glowed softly, crickets sang their steady rhythm, smoke curled gently from chimneys. For a while, all was peaceful. In that stillness, Gandalf allowed himself to hope. Hope that this place might endure. Hope that small hands could carry great burdens. Hope that kindness might yet shape the fate of the world. For now, the Shire slept peacefully. And somewhere deep beneath the hills, a quiet ring waited. At first, Gandalf tried to ignore the feeling. It was faint, like a draft slipping through a closed door. A sense that something, somewhere, was not quite as it should be. The Shire still laughed, still baked, still slept beneath warm lantern light. Yet beneath it all, something felt misaligned. Gandalf had known this feeling before, long ago, in darker places. It was the feeling of time tightening its grip. He noticed it first in Bilbo. Not in anything he said, but in the things he didn't. The way his hand lingered just a moment too long near his pocket. The way his laughter sometimes arrived half a breath too late. And how his eyes sometimes seemed older than they should be. Gandalf said nothing. He watched. That was his way. At night, when the Shire slept, he walked its borders alone. The wind carried old scents, wet earth, distant smoke, things remembered rather than seen. And in those quiet hours, his thoughts drifted east, toward lands where shadows lengthened, toward a name long unspoken. Sauron. The Dark Lord had not vanished, not truly. He had only waited. And waiting, Gandalf knew, was one of his greatest strengths. There were whispers now, subtle movements in the world. Creatures stirring in places long silent, eyes watching roads once forgotten. Thing a hobbit would notice. But Gandalf was no hobbit. He remembered the wars of old. He remembered the cost of delay. And so, quietly, he began to search. Old scrolls were unrolled, dusty volumes studied by candlelight. He read of rings, of power, and of deceit. Most were harmless trinkets, crafted by lesser hands. But one was different. A ring that carried a will of its own, a hunger. A piece of its maker's soul. Gandalf's heart grew heavy. He had hoped, foolishly, that it had been lost forever, that the world had been spared. Yet the signs were too clear. Slowly, with great reluctance, a terrible thought took shape. What if the ring had not been lost at all? What if it had merely been waiting? Waiting for the right moment, the right bearer, the right kind of heart. Gandalf looked again toward Bag End. Warm light glowed in the windows. Laughter drifted softly into the night. Such a small place. And yet, so much rested there. He felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. The knowledge that peace is often most fragile just before it breaks. Still, he did not act. Not yet. For hope still lingered. And as long as hope remained, there was time. Time for courage. Time for mercy. Time for choices that would shape the fate of all. But somewhere, far beyond the Shire, something had begun to stir. And soon, the quiet would end. The fire was low in the hearth, not dying, just resting. Its glow stretched softly across the round walls of Bag End, catching on shelves lined with books, maps, and memories. Outside, the hill slept beneath the stars. Inside, peace lingered like a held breath. Bilbo Baggins sat in his favorite chair, a cup of tea warming his hands, his feet tucked neatly beneath him. This was his world, a place shaped by comfort and routine. And tonight, everything felt almost perfect. The kettle whispered softly, the clock ticked with gentle patience. Outside, the Shire rested without worry. Bilbo turned a page in his book and sighed contentedly. He had always loved evenings like this, moments where time seemed to slow just for him. He didn't know why, but lately those moments felt fragile. As if they were asking to be remembered. The fire popped softly. And for just a moment, Bilbo thought he felt something stir beneath his waistcoat. Not discomfort, not pain. Just a faint warmth. He frowned slightly, then shook his head. "Nerves," he muttered. "Too much cake before bed." He stood and wandered toward the round window, peering out at the quiet hill. Fireflies blinked gently near the hedges. Somewhere, an owl called. Everything was exactly as it should be. And yet, deep in his chest, a feeling stirred that had no name. A tug. A memory he couldn't quite remember. Far away, beyond the borders of the Shire, something ancient shifted. A thought moved through the dark, slow and patient. "Not yet," it whispered. Inside Bag End, Bilbo returned to his chair, unaware of how close the world was to changing. He reached for his book again, then paused. His fingers brushed against something cool and smooth. The ring. He stared at it for a long moment. It looked so ordinary. A simple band of gold, unmarked, unassuming. And yet, it felt warm, almost alive. Bilbo frowned again, then chuckled softly. "Fancy that," he murmured, "talking myself into fancies." He slipped the ring back into his pocket and returned to his chair. Outside, the wind shifted. Far away, far beyond the Shire. Something listened. In the quiet spaces between heartbeats, a shadow stirred, not yet strong, but waking. Still, for this moment, the Shire slept on. The fire crackled softly, the kettle cooled, the night held its breath. And inside Bag End, beneath a gentle hill, peace lingered. Just a little while longer.